Marcus Cole had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks. The manila folder sat on the passenger seat of his truck, papers signed, sealed, ready to end 11 years of marriage the moment he walked through those hospital doors. He told himself it was justice. What he did not expect, what no version of his plan accounted for, was the man in the white coat who stopped him in the hallway outside his mother's recovery room and asked him a single question that would unravel everything he thought he understood about his wife. "Do you know who already paid for your mother's surgery?" Marcus didn't. He was about to. 6 months earlier, Grace Cole had been given weeks to live without the operation. The family's insurance covered barely a third of it. Marcus remembered the sleepless nights running numbers that never added up. Then, quietly, the bill was settled. No note. No explanation. He assumed it was some hospital charity fund. He never once thought to ask his own wife where that money had gone. Today was supposed to be simple. Serve the papers. Walk away. Instead, standing in that sterile hallway with his mother still unconscious 20 feet away, Marcus Cole was about to learn that the woman he was divorcing had been keeping a secret far larger than anything he could have imagined. And once he knew it, there would be no walking away without wondering, for the rest of his life, exactly what he'd just destroyed. Stay with us, because what happens next in that hallway will change how you see every person you think you already know. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Renata Cole did not cry in that hallway, though she wanted to. She had learned decades ago that tears in front of the wrong people were simply information handed over for free, and she had never once been in the business of giving anything away for free that she hadn't chosen to give. So she stood with her back against the cool wall, breathing slow, and let the ache pass through her the way weather passes through a house built to withstand it. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She answered it low, turned toward the window at the end of the corridor, and said only a handful of words before hanging up, words that meant nothing to anyone who might have overheard them and everything to the person who understood exactly what they set in motion. Then she reached into her bag and touched something worn and smooth, the way a woman's fingers find comfort in the dark, and walked back into the room to sit with the very people who had just put her out of it. Here is a thing worth understanding before the story moves forward. Renata had been shamed inside that family before, more than once, in front of more strangers than this one waiting room could hold. And every single time, without a single one of them noticing, something behind the curtain of her life had shifted quietly in her favor. This would be the last time it ever needed to move. To understand how a woman absorbs so much and breaks so little, you have to go back further than this hospital, further than Nashville, further than Marcus and his family ever thought to look. Renata grew up 2 hours outside the city, in a town where the paved roads gave out at the edge of a cornfield and turned to gravel. Her mother died when she was 9, a slow illness that had eaten away at the family's finances long before it took her life, and her father left not long after, unable, in his own words, to look at a daughter who reminded him so completely of the wife he'd lost. It was her grandmother, a woman named Odessa, who took her in without a moment's hesitation, raising her on scripture, hard work, and a spine like a fence post set in concrete. Odessa was already past 60 by then, with a bad hip and hands that ached in the cold, but she never once let the girl see that taking her in was anything but the easiest decision Odessa had ever made. They had little, but Odessa taught the girl early that being poor and being small were two entirely different conditions, and only one of them was ever a choice. She cleaned houses on the good side of town, 3 of them on a rotating schedule, and came home most evenings with her knuckles cracked and swollen from bleach and hot water, and still she cooked, and still she sat the child down on the porch in the last light of day and worked slowly through her hair with a wide-toothed comb that had belonged to her own mother before her. Renata remembered those evenings more clearly than almost anything else from her childhood, the smell of Odessa's hands, the particular quiet of the porch as the light faded, the sound of crickets starting up in the field beyond the fence. One evening, when Renata was perhaps 12, a woman from one of the houses Odessa cleaned had said something cruel to her that day, some offhand comment about people like them not knowing how to properly care for good linens, and Odessa had come home that evening more tired than usual, though she never repeated the comment to the child directly. It was that same evening she pressed the wooden comb into the girl's palm and told her that a woman who could sit still and work through the knots without yanking, without panic in her hands, was a woman who would not lose her head when the storm came. And the storm, she said, always comes. Patience is a kind of power the world spends its whole life trying to convince you doesn't exist. Don't believe it, not for a single day. Renata asked her that night whether the woman from the house that day had been right, whether people like them really didn't know how to take care of nice things, and Odessa had laughed, a short, sharp laugh with no bitterness in it at all, and told her that people who worry about linens have never once had to worry about anything that actually mattered, and that this, more than any fine tablecloth, was the real poverty in that house. Renata carried that comb everywhere after that. It was in her bag right now, more than 30 years later, tucked beside a phone she had just used for a call nobody else in that hallway had heard. She grew up soft-hearted in a way the world tends to punish. There was a widow down the road named Miss Corinne, a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and every friend her own age, and when illness finally caught up with her, there was nobody left to sit through the nights but a girl not yet 14. Renata went anyway, walking the half-mile down the gravel road after supper most evenings, and she sat through those nights spooning broth between cracked lips, changing linens, holding a near stranger's hand in the dark for no pay and no thanks, and no reason except that it was right. Miss Corinne used to tell her, in the last months, that most people visited the dying out of guilt and left as soon as it was decent to leave, but that Renata sat like she had nowhere better to be, and that this, more than any medicine, was the thing that made the nights bearable. Miss Corinne passed on a cold February morning with Renata still in the room, having fallen asleep in the chair beside the bed sometime after 2, and it was Renata who woke to the particular stillness of a room that has changed, and who sat with the body for nearly an hour before calling anyone, not out of fear, but because she felt it would have been rude, somehow, to rush the goodbye. It was a small county paper that ran a short notice of Miss Corinne's passing, and it mentioned, almost in passing, a young neighbor girl who had cared for her faithfully in her final months, the first time Renata's name had ever appeared in print, though she never told anyone in her later life that she still kept that clipping folded inside an old Bible on her nightstand. Renata didn't know it then, but she was learning the one skill that would eventually build her entire fortune, how to care for a failing body, and how, in time, to construct something lasting around that care. She earned her first wages the same tender way, cleaning rooms at a roadside motel through high school summers, changing sheets that smelled of cigarettes and highway dust, scrubbing bathtubs that other girls her age refused to touch. The motel's owner, a gruff but fair man named Hollis, was one of the few people outside her grandmother's house who ever told her plainly that she worked harder than anyone twice her age he'd employed, a compliment Renata held on to for years afterward, in the particular way a person holds onto the rare praise that arrives without any strings attached to it. Every dollar she made went into a coffee tin she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the room she shared with nobody, because by then Odessa's health had begun to fail too, and there was rarely money left over for anything beyond the essentials. Coin by coin, for 10 long years, she filled that tin and emptied it into a savings account at the one bank in town and filled it again, learning young the one truth nobody would ever manage to shame out of her. What you build slowly with your own 2 hands belongs to you, in a way nothing handed to you ever can. She kept a small notebook, too, in those years, where she wrote down not dreams exactly, but numbers, the cost of nursing school, the cost of a used car reliable enough to get her to classes, the cost of a life that did not depend on anybody else's permission. Odessa passed the spring after Renata turned 20, quietly, in her sleep, in the same bed she'd slept in for 40 years, and it was Renata who found her the next morning and who, in the numb days that followed, kept returning to one particular memory above all the others, the sound of that comb working through her hair on the porch, the crickets, the certainty in Odessa's voice that the storm always comes, and that patience was the one thing nobody could ever take from a person who had truly claimed it as their own. That was the girl. Patient, tender, underestimated on purpose, because being underestimated turned out to be safer than being seen. She left for Nashville the summer after Odessa passed, with the coffee tin savings, the wooden comb, and an acceptance letter to a nursing program that had taken her 3 attempts and 2 years of night classes to earn. The city frightened her at first, in a way she never admitted to anyone. The sheer size of it, the speed of it, the way nobody on those streets seemed to know or care who her grandmother had been or what porch she'd grown up sitting on. She found a room in a boarding house run by a retired schoolteacher who charged less rent to tenants willing to help with the upkeep, and Renata scrubbed floors and hauled trash twice a week in exchange for $40 off the monthly rate, a trade she made without complaint because she had long since stopped seeing labor as something beneath her. She worked the overnight shift at a diner near campus to cover what the scholarship didn't, a place called Dell's that stayed open past midnight mostly for truckers and night shift nurses and the occasional lonely soul who simply didn't want to go home yet. The pay was modest and the hours were brutal against a full-course load, but the tips, on a good night, covered textbooks the scholarship wouldn't, and Renata learned quickly which regulars needed extra kindness in their coffee and which ones just wanted to be left alone with their thoughts. It was there, exhausted and wiping down a counter at 2 in the morning, that she first met Renata Cole. He came in that first night looking like a man who had run out of better options, which, as it turned out, he had. He ordered black coffee because it was the cheapest thing on the menu that still counted as ordering something, and he sat at the far end of the counter with a folder of rejected job applications he didn't think anyone had noticed. Renata noticed. She refilled his cup without being asked and without charging him for the second one, a small kindness that cost the diner nothing on paper, but that Marcus, in the state he was in that year, felt like the first genuinely unconditional thing anyone had offered him in longer than he could remember. He came back the next night, and the night after that, and within a few weeks he was telling her things he hadn't told his own brother, about the business program he'd dropped out of, about a father who died still disappointed in him, about a mother working herself thin at a textile plant while her younger son floundered from job to job with nothing to show for it. Renata listened the way Odessa had once taught her to listen, without rushing to fix what wasn't hers to fix, and somewhere in those months of 2 a.m. coffee refills, something steadier than infatuation took root between them. She never once made him feel small for the folder of rejections, never once implied that she was doing him some favor by paying him attention. She simply treated him like a man who was going to figure it out eventually, and that, more than anything else anyone had offered him, was what made Marcus fall for her. Now hold that girl up against the woman sitting in the corner chair of a Nashville hospital, waiting to hear if her mother-in-law would live through the afternoon. Renata had met Marcus when he was at the very bottom of his life, broke, doubted by his own family, going nowhere anyone could point to. He had dropped out of a business program once already, had cycled through 3 jobs in 2 years, and used to sit at the counter of that diner most nights nursing a single cup of coffee because it was the only thing he could afford and the only place that didn't ask him to leave. Renata refilled his cup without being asked and never once made him feel small for staying past closing. She believed in him when nobody else in his life would spend the breath. She worked 2 jobs while he went back and finished his degree, covering rent some months entirely on her own. She co-signed loans nobody else would put their name on, sat up with him rehearsing interview answers, drove him to job sites before dawn when his own car had been repossessed. She stood behind him and poured herself into the low place he was living in until he climbed out of it, standing, whether he ever admitted it or not, on her shoulders. And that was the first hairline crack in everything that came after. Marcus never quite forgave her for having witnessed him weak. A proud man carries that kind of debt his whole life and calls it by some prettier name so he doesn't have to look at it directly. In the early years of the marriage, he called it gratitude and meant it, mostly. By the 5th year, he had started calling it something closer to obligation, a debt he resented owing even as he never quite managed to repay it. By the 10th year, he rarely called it anything at all, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging a version of himself he preferred to forget had ever existed. So what does a woman do when the world keeps mistaking her patience for something small, year after year, dinner after dinner, holiday after holiday? She waits, not out of fear, but because she is building, and building is a thing that happens in a place other people's eyes cannot reach until the day it's finished. The early years of the marriage were not unhappy, and it does this story no favors to pretend otherwise. Marcus, once he found steady work at a mid-sized logistics firm, threw himself into providing in the ways he understood providing to mean, and for a while, that effort was enough to paper over the growing silence underneath it. Renata finished her nursing degree 2 years into the marriage, working nights at Baptist Memorial while Marcus climbed the ranks at his firm. And there were good years in there, real ones, vacations they saved for together, a small house they bought with both their names on the deed, a marriage that from the outside looked exactly like what either of them would have described, if asked, as a success. There was a particular summer, their 4th year married, that Renata sometimes still thought back to when she needed to remember that the man Marcus had become was not the only version of him that had ever existed. They had driven together to the Gulf Coast for a week, the first real vacation either of them had taken since childhood, and Marcus had spent an entire afternoon teaching her to swim in water deeper than she'd ever trusted herself in before, patient in a way he rarely managed to be patient about anything else, holding her steady until she found her own rhythm, laughing with her rather than at her when she splashed too hard, trying to keep her head above the waves. She had thought, watching him that afternoon, that she had married a man capable of real gentleness, and she was not wrong, exactly. She had simply not yet understood how much that gentleness depended on him feeling secure, and how quickly it could curdle into something else entirely once his own sense of himself began to falter. The falling apart happened slowly enough that neither of them could point to a single day it began. It was less a single crack than 1,000 small omissions, an anniversary Marcus forgot 2 years running, a promotion Renata quietly declined because accepting it would have meant earning visibly more than her husband, and she had already begun, without fully admitting it to herself, managing his ego the way a nurse manages a patient's pain, carefully, preemptively, before it could flare into something neither of them wanted to look at directly. By their 7th year, they had stopped taking vacations together at all, Marcus citing work, Renata citing the growing demands of a business she had by then stopped mentioning much at home, and the two of them settled into a rhythm that looked, from a distance, like contentment, and up close, like two people who had quietly agreed to stop asking each other real questions. It was during her 3rd year working the surgical floor that Renata first noticed the pattern that would eventually define the rest of her working life. She watched, more times than she could count, a family in the waiting room receive good news about a surgery only to be handed, within hours, a bill that undid every bit of relief they'd just felt. She watched a young father delay a necessary procedure for his daughter by nearly a month while insurance disputes dragged on, a delay that nearly cost the child her life. She started keeping a small notebook of these stories the same way she'd once kept a notebook of numbers back in that gravel road town. Except now the numbers were other people's, and the debt she felt toward fixing it wasn't financial so much as it was personal, rooted in every night she'd once spent caring for Miss Corinne for no pay because it was simply the right thing to do. She started her company almost by accident, taking on a single elderly client whose family couldn't afford full-time nursing care but needed more than the hospital could provide after discharge. Word spread through the same slow, patient channels that had always served her well, one family telling another, one discharge planner recommending her to a colleague, and within 18 months she had 4 nurses working under her informally, and a waiting list longer than she could handle alone. She incorporated the business formally in her 5th year of marriage, using savings she had kept separate since before the wedding, a habit Odessa had drilled into her without ever explaining fully why, and she grew it slowly and deliberately, the same patient way she'd once filled a coffee tin, reinvesting every dollar the business made instead of drawing a salary that matched what it was worth. And by the time Grace Cole collapsed in her kitchen, the company operated across 3 counties, under a name none of Marcus's family had ever thought to connect to the quiet woman who sat in corners and rarely spoke first at dinner. She kept it that way on purpose. She had learned early in the marriage that anything Marcus perceived as her having more than him needed to be managed carefully, folded small, kept out of conversation, and so she simply never brought it up, and he simply never asked, and the two of them built an entire decade on a silence neither one ever named. With what that business earned, she had done one thing above everything else. 5 years earlier, after watching a young mother in one of her own client families lose her husband not because the surgical team lacked skill, but because a hospital billing office had delayed authorization for 6 critical hours while insurance disputes dragged on, Renata had gone to Baptist Memorial's administration and asked what it would take to guarantee that families in true medical emergencies never faced that delay again. The answer was a foundation, funded privately, structured so that its benefactor's name never appeared on a single piece of patient paperwork. Its only visible signature, the words Charitable Surgical Fund, printed quietly at the bottom of a bill that read zero balance due. She had funded it, quietly, and without her name ever touching a single document. And for 5 years it had gone on operating in the background of that hospital's surgical wing, saving lives nobody in her own family had ever once thought to ask her about. Grace had raised Marcus and Whitman largely on her own after their father passed when the boys were still in grade school, working double shifts at a textile plant that no longer exists, the kind of work that leaves a woman's hands permanently stiff by 50 and her pride permanently tender about ever needing anyone's help. She had buried her husband on a Thursday and been back at the plant by the following Monday, because the family could not survive on savings alone, and because, as she told her sons more than once over the years, grief was a luxury a woman raising 2 boys alone rarely got to fully indulge. She raised Marcus and Whitman on a code of quiet endurance that neither of them ever fully examined. The unspoken rule that a Cole man did not complain, did not ask for help, and certainly did not admit weakness in front of people outside the immediate family. A code that had served Grace well enough in her own life, but that neither of her sons had ever learned to apply with any real self-awareness. If there was one person in that family who had ever shown Renata something close to real warmth, it was Grace. Grace had been the one who called on her birthday when nobody else remembered, the one who sent a card the year Renata lost a pregnancy nobody in the family ever spoke of again, a loss that had happened in their 6th year of marriage and that Marcus, in the exhaustion of his own grief, had handled by retreating into work rather than toward his wife, leaving Renata to grieve largely on her own except for the quiet, consistent presence of a mother-in-law who somehow understood, without being told directly, exactly how much support Renata needed and exactly how to offer it without ever making a show of the offering. Grace had also, on one memorable occasion, quietly, in the kitchen after a holiday dinner where Marcus had made some offhand comment about Renata's cooking not measuring up to his mother's, told her son under her breath that he ought to be ashamed of himself, and that a man was lucky to find a woman who worked as hard as his wife did without ever once asking for credit. Grace never repeated the comment to Renata directly, but Renata had overheard it from the hallway, carrying dessert plates back to the kitchen, and had carried it, quietly, the way she carried most things that mattered to her, a small private proof that at least one person in that family had been paying attention all along. So when Grace collapsed in her kitchen at 5 in the morning with what would turn out to be a ruptured aneurysm, it was Renata who got the call first, from a neighbor who still had her number saved from years back. Renata, who was dressed and in her car before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and Renata, who sat in the surgical wing signing consent forms with a steady hand while the rest of the family was still hunting for their shoes. Marcus and Whitman had been building something else entirely over the past several months, in rooms Renata wasn't invited into, over dinners she hadn't been asked to attend. Whitman ran the family's small logistics company, a trucking and freight outfit their late father had started with 2 vehicles and a handshake reputation, and it had been bleeding money for 2 years, hemorrhaging contracts to competitors with newer trucks, better software, and margins Whitman's aging fleet simply couldn't compete against. He had taken out loans against equipment that was already worth less than what he owed on it. He had missed payroll twice the previous winter and covered it only by draining what remained of his own savings. A buyer had finally come forward, a cautious, methodical man named Prentice Holloway, no relation to the family, willing to purchase the company outright and keep both brothers employed at a fraction of the stress and none of the debt that came with ownership. But Holloway, during due diligence, had made one thing clear. He would not put his name on a deal with a man whose personal life looked unstable. He had said as much directly to Whitman over a lunch meeting that Whitman later recounted to Marcus nearly word for word, that a messy, public divorce in the middle of negotiations read to him as a man who couldn't manage his own affairs, let alone a company's, and that he had walked away from 2 prior deals for exactly that reason and had no intention of making the same mistake a 3rd time. Whitman had said as much to Marcus, flatly, more than once, in the kind of tone brothers use when they've stopped bothering to be gentle with each other. End this today. Sign her off. Clean this up before Friday, or watch everything the family had left go under with it. It would be easy to make Whitman into a cartoon, a man twirling a mustache, plotting in shadows. He was not that. He was frightened. In the particular way men get frightened when a business they built their whole identity around starts slipping through their fingers, when their father's name on the side of a truck is the closest thing they have left to the man himself, and fear dressed up as urgency has convinced better men than Whitman to do worse things than this. He told himself, in the quiet hours when he let himself think about it honestly, that he wasn't asking Marcus to do anything Marcus didn't already want to do anyway, and there was enough truth buried in that thought to let him sleep most nights. Whitman had tried, in his own limited way, to solve the company's problems through legitimate means first. He had taken out a second loan against his own house without telling his wife, a decision that had already begun straining that marriage in ways he hadn't fully reckoned with. He had let go of 2 longtime drivers, men who had worked for his father before him, a decision that still woke him some nights with a guilt he never spoke aloud. He had driven routes himself on weekends to cut costs, arriving home exhausted and short-tempered, and none of it had been enough to close the gap between what the company owed and what it earned. By the time Holloway's offer came through, Whitman had convinced himself it was the only lifeline left, and he was not going to watch it slip away over what he privately considered his brother's midlife foolishness with another woman, a foolishness he disapproved of morally, but was fully prepared to weaponize practically if it meant saving the family business. He met with Holloway's assistant 3 separate times in the month before Grace's surgery, each meeting a little tenser than the last, each one ending with a variation of the same warning, that Holloway valued stability above almost everything else in a potential partner and that his patience for uncertainty was not unlimited. Whitman relayed these warnings to Marcus almost verbatim, sometimes softening them, sometimes sharpening them depending on his own mood that day, and Marcus, already halfway convinced by Bianca that his marriage was a mistake worth correcting, found in his brother's urgency a convenient permission structure for a decision he was already leaning toward making. Bianca Reyes worked the softer angle. She had been circling Marcus for the better part of a year, ever since a logistics conference in Memphis where he'd had one too many drinks and told her, in a moment he likely didn't remember clearly the next morning, that he sometimes felt like he'd married beneath himself, that his own mother had once said as much at a family dinner years back, a comment he'd misremembered entirely, having caught only the tail end of Grace's words in the hallway and inverted their meaning completely without ever realizing it, and that every day Renata stood beside him felt like a quiet public confession of that fact. Bianca had filed that sentence away carefully, the way a person files away the one piece of information that will matter most later, and she brought it back out slowly, patiently, over the following months, over calls that started as work check-ins and stretched later and later into the evening, telling him he had spent his whole life apologizing for who he'd settled for, and that he didn't have to anymore. Bianca was not, herself, a villain born fully formed either, though the story asks less patience of us in her case. She had grown up watching her own mother stay in a marriage that had long since stopped serving her, out of a fear of starting over that Bianca had promised herself she would never inherit, and somewhere in the years since, that promise had curdled into a belief that other people's marriages were simply obstacles standing between herself and whatever she decided she deserved. She worked alongside Marcus at the logistics firm, close enough to notice the small daily tells of a man who felt unseen at home, and far enough removed from Renata's actual life to never once have to reckon with the person she was displacing as anything more than an abstraction, a name mentioned occasionally and never met. She began meeting Marcus for dinners that he told Renata were client obligations, dinners that grew, over the months, from professional to something else entirely, though neither of them ever named it plainly, even to each other, preferring the comfort of pretending it was simply 2 people who understood each other better than anyone else did. It was Bianca who first suggested, gently, over one of these dinners, that he speak to an attorney, not because she wanted to force his hand exactly, but because she had grown impatient with being a secret, and impatience, dressed up as concern for his happiness, is a very effective tool. Marcus began seeing a divorce attorney 6 weeks before the surgery, a brisk, efficient woman named Deborah Oyagi who asked him plainly, in their first consultation, whether there was another party involved, and whether he understood that the answer to that question would matter a great deal in how the proceedings unfolded. Marcus told her there wasn't, which was not entirely true and not entirely false either. in the particular way a man convinces himself of things he needs to believe in order to keep moving forward with a plan he is already half committed to. Deborah, for her part, had handled enough of these cases to recognize the shape of the lie without needing him to admit to it directly, and she drew up the papers he asked for regardless, filing away her own private doubts about a client who couldn't quite look her in the eye when discussing his own marriage. None of what happened next was an accident, and none of it happened in a single dramatic instant. It was built the way most quiet cruelties are built, in small increments, across many ordinary afternoons, until the people building it had convinced themselves it was simply the sensible thing to do. Now type 1 if you think Marcus already suspected what Renata had been hiding, or type 2 if you think this blindsided him completely, and stay with us, because what happens in the next 20 minutes changes everything you think you understand about every person in this story. The weeks leading up to Grace's collapse were, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Renata continued running her company, taking calls in her car between hospital visits to clients across the county, reviewing payroll late at night after Marcus had gone to bed. Marcus continued meeting Bianca under the cover of work dinners that ran longer than any project required. Whitman continued fielding calls from Holloway's assistant, each one a little more clipped than the last, each one a reminder of a deadline closing in. Grace, for her part, had complained of headaches for nearly 2 weeks before the collapse. Headaches she dismissed as stress and age and refused to mention to her sons because she didn't want to be a burden, a habit of self-erasure she had practiced her whole adult life and had, without either of them noticing, passed down to exactly one person in that family who understood it completely. It was Renata, in fact, who had noticed Grace rubbing her temples at a Sunday dinner 3 weeks before the collapse and had gently suggested she see a doctor, an offer Grace waved off the way she waved off most offers of care directed at herself. And it was Renata who called twice in the following 2 weeks just to check in, calls Grace answered warmly in Marcus when he noticed them at all, dismissed as his wife inserting herself where she wasn't needed. There was a particular Tuesday, 10 days before the surgery, that Renata would later think back on more than any other. She had stopped by Grace's house on her way home from a client visit, bringing a container of soup she'd made the night before, and had found Grace sitting at her kitchen table with the lights off, holding her head in both hands. Grace had insisted it was nothing, just a bad afternoon, and Renata had not pushed, though she had left a note on the refrigerator with the number for her own cardiologist just in case, a note Grace never mentioned to either of her sons, and that Renata found again, weeks later, still taped to the refrigerator door when she came by to help pack an overnight bag for the hospital stay that followed. Marcus, during those same 10 days, was consumed almost entirely with his own unraveling plan. He met with Deborah Oyagi twice more to finalize the paperwork, choosing, at Bianca's quiet suggestion, to have the papers ready rather than filed, so that the timing of serving them could remain entirely his own decision. He told himself this was simply being organized. He did not examine too closely why some part of him wanted the option to choose the worst possible moment, though later, sitting alone with the torn papers on his kitchen table, he would understand that impulse for exactly what it had been. The morning of the surgery, Renata arrived before dawn, same as she always did, and sat through the early hours answering questions from nurses, signing forms, and quietly, from a hallway near the elevator, taking a call she didn't explain to anyone in the family, a call that would only make sense to anyone watching hours later. She had built her foundation on precisely that condition years earlier, after watching too many families in that same hospital lose someone not because the surgeon lacked skill, but because the bill came before the care did. She had never wanted credit for it. She had wanted, simply, for families like the one she'd married into, who would never in 100 years have thought to thank her, to never have to know how close they'd come to losing someone over a number on a page. The woman who answered that early call was someone Renata trusted completely, someone who asked, as she often did on the harder mornings, whether Renata was doing all right herself. Renata told her, honestly, that she didn't yet know, and the voice on the other end of the line, who understood better than almost anyone what Renata carried in silence, told her simply to call if she needed anything at all, day or night, and meant it. Marcus arrived 2 hours later, loud the way he entered every room, and did not look at his wife. He had spent the drive over rehearsing. In his head, the exact wording he intended to use once the moment came, testing different phrases against each other the way a man tests the fit of a suit he's already decided to buy regardless of how it sits on him. Whitman came in not long after, doing the quiet arithmetic he always did with his eyes, glancing at his phone every few minutes as though Holloway's decision might arrive by text at any moment, his jaw tight in a way that betrayed just how much rode, in his own mind, on what happened in this room over the coming hours. Bianca arrived last, sliding her hand into the bend of Marcus's arm as though the gesture had been rehearsed, which, in a sense, it had, having been discussed between them the night before as a way of establishing, publicly and immediately, exactly where things now stood. When the young nurse at the desk asked who counted as immediate family, Marcus answered before Renata could open her mouth, and the name he gave the nurse was not his wife's. The nurse, a young woman not more than a few years out of school, glanced briefly at Renata, an expression crossing her face that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, the particular discomfort of a professional trained to stay neutral encountering a moment that made neutrality feel impossible. Renata felt that moment land somewhere just beneath her ribs, and she let it land without giving her face away. She had absorbed worse from this family over 11 years than a nurse writing down the wrong name on a clipboard, and she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes after you've stopped expecting better from someone, that today was simply going to be the day the ledger closed. When two good chairs opened by the window, Marcus told his wife to give hers up, told her she was used to standing, told her to wait out in the hallway where she'd feel more comfortable. She did not argue. She gathered her bag, straightened her coat, and walked out of that room with her spine as straight as it had ever been, and not one person watching her leave understood yet what they had just done. Whitman muttered something low and cruel as she passed, the kind of comment that gets laughed off in rooms like that one, something about women who never grow into the rooms they're given, and Bianca settled into the warm chair by the window with the satisfied look of a woman who believed she had already won something. A few of the strangers scattered through that waiting room noticed, the way strangers sometimes do, and looked away out of a discomfort they couldn't quite name, the particular embarrassment of witnessing a cruelty that isn't yours to address. An older man near the coffee machine, whose own wife was somewhere upstairs in a different wing entirely, watched Renata walk out with something like recognition in his eyes, though neither of them ever exchanged a word about it. A younger woman seated near the door, there for an entirely unrelated appointment, later told a friend that she almost said something, almost stood up on Renata's behalf, and had spent the rest of that day regretting that she hadn't, a small private guilt that had nothing to do with the Cole family at all, and everything to do with the particular helplessness strangers feel in rooms like that one. Alone in the hallway, Renata allowed herself exactly one long breath, and then her phone buzzed, and she took the call that mattered most, the one confirming that Dr. Samuel Ortiz's team had everything they needed, that the delicate portion of the surgery was proceeding, and that Grace's vitals, while fragile, were holding. She hung up, pressed the corner of one eye that had not quite spilled over, and walked back into the waiting room to sit among people who had just made it very clear she wasn't welcome there. It was in that room, an hour later, with the family gathered and the tension in the air thick enough to taste, that Marcus made his decision. He had been carrying the folder in his car for 3 weeks, papers signed, notarized, ready, and he had told himself repeatedly that today, of all days, made a strange kind of sense. She would be raw. She would be exhausted. She would sign quickly just to make the discomfort stop, and it would be finished before his mother even woke up from anesthesia. He had rehearsed the moment in his head more than once, had imagined her face falling, had imagined the relief of finally being done with a marriage he had spent months convincing himself he had outgrown. He walked back out to his truck during a lull in the waiting, retrieved the folder, and returned to set it down on the low table between the benches, sliding it slowly across the surface so that every stranger in that room could watch it make the trip toward his wife. "Renata Cole," he said, loud enough to reach the back row of chairs, "sign it. We can both move on with our lives." The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when strangers realize they are witnessing something they were never meant to see. A father hushed the child asleep on his shoulder. A young man near the vending machine stopped chewing entirely. The older man by the coffee machine set his cup down without drinking from it. The young woman near the door who would later regret her silence sat up straighter, watching, Whitman lifted his phone, thumb already finding the record button, murmuring something about wanting this on camera, wanting people to see how calm she stayed under pressure, as though her composure were itself a kind of confession. Bianca tilted her head, watching, her expression somewhere between pity and satisfaction, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, that she genuinely wasn't sure Renata understood what was happening to her. For a long moment, Renata sat with her hands folded in her lap, and the room read her stillness as surrender. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily behind a closed door, indifferent to everything unfolding in the waiting room, and Renata found herself, for just a moment, listening to it instead of to the people in front of her, the way a person sometimes reaches for something small and steady to hold on to when everything else in a room has gone loud. She reached into her bag, and the family watched, certain they knew exactly what was coming next. She drew out the small wooden comb her grandmother had given her more than 30 years earlier and set it gently on the table beside the papers, the way a person sets down a weight they have finally decided they are done carrying. Then she picked up the pen. She did not sign. She lifted her phone instead, dialed a number she had memorized years before this family ever mattered to her, and set it flat on the table, on speaker, so the voice that answered climbed up and filled the entire waiting room. Good afternoon. This is the Ortiz Surgical Foundation office, the voice said, warm and professional. It was Faith, though nobody in that room would ever learn her name. It's me, Renata said, even and clear. I need you to confirm something out loud for the people sitting with me. Of course, ma'am. A brief pause, papers shifting on the other end of the line. Whatever you need. You're our founder and our sole benefactor, the voice continued. The foundation underwrites the entire charity surgical program here at Baptist Memorial. Dr. Ortiz operates under your funding. His fee today, along with the full cost of Grace Cole's surgery, bills directly to your account, exactly as it always has. Everything is already covered in full. Would you like us to proceed as normal? You could hear the whole room breathing. Yes, Renata said, her eyes never once leaving Marcus's face. Proceed. Save her. That was never in question. She ended the call and set the phone face down on the table, beside the comb, beside the papers nobody had signed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 10 years, while this family called her dead weight to her face and worse behind her back, Renata Cole had been quietly building something none of them ever thought to look for. Not stealing, not sitting on some hidden windfall she was keeping out of spite. Building, the same slow way her grandmother had once worked through the knots in a child's hair, patient, unhurried, without panic in her hands. She had taken a soft heart and a hidden coffee tin and one skill first learned holding a dying widow's hand, and grown it. Over years nobody in that family had bothered to notice passing, into a company that now employed over 200 people across 3 counties, and into a foundation that had quietly funded the exact surgeon whose hands were, in that very hour, the only thing standing between Grace Cole and the end of her life. Whitman lowered his phone slowly, the recording still running, though he seemed to have forgotten why he'd started it. Bianca's satisfied expression had gone thin and uncertain, her hand slipping from Marcus's arm for the first time all morning. And Marcus stood over the table, staring at the folder he'd carried in his truck for 3 weeks, understanding for the first time in his marriage that the woman he had just tried to humiliate in front of a room full of strangers had been carrying not only his family's shame, but its survival, and had never once asked for a single word of thanks. The room around them did not return to normal right away. The father with the sleeping child looked at Renata with something close to awe. The older man by the coffee machine picked his cup back up and finally took a sip, as though the moment had needed permission to move forward again. A woman 2 seats down, who had said nothing all morning, reached over without a word and squeezed Renata's hand once before letting go, a small gesture between strangers that Renata would remember long after she'd forgotten most of what else was said that day. The nurse who had, earlier that day, written down the wrong name on a clipboard, approached quietly a few minutes later and asked Renata, gently, if she needed anything. Renata shook her head, thanked her, and asked only that someone let her know the moment there was news from upstairs. It was, everyone in that room would later agree, the calmest anyone had behaved all day, and it was Whitman, of all people, who finally broke the long silence that followed, asking his brother in a low voice whether he understood what he had almost done. Marcus did not answer him. He sat down heavily in the chair Bianca had vacated without either of them quite noticing when she'd moved, and put his head in his hands. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he thought not about the business, not about Bianca, not about the version of his life he'd been building in secret for months, but about the woman who had sat beside him at a diner counter 15 years earlier and refilled his coffee without being asked, and about every single thing he had managed to convince himself she owed him nothing for. 3 hours later, Dr. Ortiz walked into that same waiting room still in his scrubs, exhaustion written plainly across his face, and told the family that Grace had come through the surgery, that the next 48 hours would matter most, but that her chances, given everything they had been fighting against that morning, were far better than anyone had dared hope at sunrise. He thanked Renata directly, by name, for a donation she had made to the foundation years earlier that had funded the exact equipment used in Grace's procedure, equipment that had, in his own words, made the difference between an operation he could attempt and one he couldn't. And it was in that moment, in front of Marcus, Whitman, and Bianca, that the truth of who had been holding this family together finally became impossible to unsee. Dr. Ortiz did not know, standing in that waiting room, the particular weight his words carried for the family in front of him. He had thanked Renata this way dozens of times before, in dozens of other waiting rooms, to families who understood immediately what her name meant to their situation and families who had no idea at all who she was. And to him, this was simply one more instance of the same gratitude he felt every time her foundation's funding made the difference between a family losing someone and a family getting to keep them. He had known Renata for nearly 6 years by that point, since the foundation's earliest days, and had come to regard her, quietly, as one of the more remarkable people he'd encountered in a career spent around remarkable people, precisely because she had never once, in all those years, asked him to make her involvement known to a single patient or family. He had asked her once, early on, why she insisted on the anonymity, and she had told him simply that she remembered too well what it felt like to need help and to have that need turned into someone else's leverage, and that she had no intention of ever doing to another family what had once, in smaller ways, been done to hers. Whitman asked, quietly, once Dr. Ortiz had stepped away, how long Renata had been doing this, funding surgeries for strangers, keeping a company that sized entirely to herself, and Renata told him, honestly, that it had never been about keeping it to herself. It had been about keeping it safe, from judgment, from resentment, from exactly the conversation they were now having in a hospital corridor instead of at a kitchen table where it might have happened years earlier, under kinder circumstances, if anyone in that family had ever once asked her a real question about her own life, instead of assuming they already knew everything worth knowing about her. Marcus, standing a few feet away during this exchange, said nothing at all, though later that evening, alone in his truck in the hospital parking garage, he would sit for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine, running back through 11 years of dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings, searching for a single moment where he had ever asked his wife a question about her own life with the same curiosity he'd once brought to a diner counter as a broke 24-year-old, nursing a single cup of coffee and finding, to his considerable discomfort, that he could not locate one. Grace recovered slowly over the following weeks, moved from the surgical unit to a private room, and then, eventually, home, where a home health nurse, arranged quietly through Renata's own company, though Grace never learned that detail until much later, checked on her twice daily. The recovery was not without setbacks. There was a difficult week midway through where an infection scare sent Grace back to the hospital for observation, and it was Renata, again, who sat through those anxious hours, this time with Marcus beside her, the two of them sharing a silence that had changed shape entirely from the silence they'd shared for years before. No longer a silence built on avoidance, but one built on the slow, uncertain work of two people trying to figure out what, if anything, could still be salvaged. When Grace was finally strong enough to sit up and hold a real conversation, it was Renata who told her, gently, sitting at the edge of the hospital bed with the wooden comb still tucked in her bag, what had happened in that waiting room while she'd been unconscious. Grace listened in silence, her expression unreadable for a long moment, then reached for her daughter-in-law's hand, and said only that she had always known. In the quiet way mothers sometimes know things nobody says aloud. Exactly which woman in that family had been carrying the rest of them. She told Renata, too, that she was ashamed it had taken a hospital bed and a room full of strangers for her sons to finally see what had been standing in front of them the whole time. And that shame, she said, was hers to carry now, not Renata's. Grace did not stop there. In the weeks that followed, once she was strong enough to have Marcus over for dinner alone, she told her son plainly. In a conversation he later described to Renata almost word for word because it had shaken him that badly, that she had raised him better than the man who had stood in that waiting room, and that if he could not find his way back to deserving the woman he'd married, he needed to have the decency to let her go cleanly instead of dragging her through years of half measures. It was not the kind of thing Grace said often, and Marcus, who had spent his whole life a little afraid of disappointing his mother in ways he rarely admitted even to himself, sat with that conversation for a long time afterward. Marcus never did serve those papers. He tore them apart himself, 3 days later, sitting alone at his kitchen table long after Renata had gone to bed, the sound of the paper tearing louder in the empty house than he expected it to be. He sat with the torn pieces in front of him for nearly an hour afterward, turning over in his mind every version of the man he had been for the past several months. The version who met Bianca for dinners he called client work, the version who let his brother's panic become his own excuse, the version who had chosen, of every possible day, the day of his mother's surgery to try to break his wife in front of strangers. He did not sleep much that night, and when Renata found the torn papers in the kitchen trash the next morning, she said nothing about it, though she noticed, and filed the noticing away the same careful way she filed most things. Whether that decision came from genuine remorse or simple fear of what he stood to lose, even people close to the family couldn't say for certain, and Renata herself never fully answered that question when she was asked, not by Grace, not by Whitman, and certainly not by Marcus, who tried, more than once in the weeks that followed, to have the conversation and found himself unable to get past the first few sentences without Renata quietly changing the subject. What she did do, in the months that followed, was decide, slowly and on her own terms, exactly how much of that marriage was still worth saving, and she made that decision the same way she had built everything else in her life, patiently, without panic, and entirely on her own timeline. She moved into a guest room for a period, not as punishment exactly, but as a kind of quiet, deliberate distance she needed in order to think clearly about a decision that mattered too much to make while still absorbing the shock of it. Marcus, to his credit, did not push her on the timeline, seeming to understand, perhaps for the first time in the marriage, that this particular silence was not his to fill or hurry. There were nights during that period when Marcus sat outside the guest room door, not knocking, not saying anything, simply present in a way he had rarely bothered to be present in the years before, as though proximity alone might eventually earn back some fraction of what he'd spent a decade failing to notice he was losing. Renata was aware of him out there most of those nights. She never opened the door, not yet, but she also never asked him to stop, and in that narrow, wordless space between the two of them, something slower than forgiveness and more honest than avoidance began, very gradually, to take shape. She agreed, eventually, to see a counselor with him, not because she had decided the marriage would survive, but because she owed it to the 11 years they'd spent together to find out honestly whether it could, rather than simply assuming the answer and walking away without ever testing it. Those sessions were not easy. Marcus, in the presence of a therapist neither of them knew, was forced for the first time to say out loud the resentment he'd carried since the earliest years of the marriage, the quiet humiliation of having been the one who needed saving, and Renata, in turn, was forced to admit how much of her own silence over the years had been less about protecting the peace and more about protecting herself from ever being disappointed by his answer if she'd asked for more. There was one session, roughly 2 months into their weekly meetings, that both of them would later point to as the turning point, though neither described it that way to the other directly. The therapist, a measured woman named Dr. Priya Raman, had asked Marcus a simple question: what exactly he had believed he would gain by serving Renata those papers in that particular room, on that particular day, and Marcus had sat with the question for nearly a full minute before answering, longer than he had sat with any question in that room before. When he finally spoke, It was not the answer he had rehearsed for himself in the weeks after the hospital. Not something about Bianca or the business or even the marriage itself, but something closer to the truth he had been avoiding since the diner counter 15 years earlier, that some part of him had never fully forgiven Renata for having seen him at his lowest point, and that humiliating her in front of witnesses had felt, in some twisted way he was only now beginning to understand, like evening a score he had never once admitted keeping. Renata, hearing him say this plainly for the first time, did not respond immediately either. She sat with her hands folded the same way she had sat in that waiting room months earlier, and when she finally spoke, she told him that she had known, on some level, for years, that this resentment existed in him, and that she had spent just as many years choosing not to examine it too closely, because doing so would have required her to ask questions about her own marriage that she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. It was, both of them later agreed, the first entirely honest conversation they had had with each other in nearly a decade, and it did not fix anything immediately, but it opened a door that had been quietly sealed for a very long time. Over the months that followed, the sessions grew less about relitigating the hospital and more about the smaller, ordinary erosions that had led to it, the anniversary he'd forgotten, the promotion she'd declined, the years of small omissions that had accumulated, unnoticed, into something large enough to nearly break them both. Dr. Rahman, more than once, reminded them both that repair was not the same thing as forgetting, and that a marriage capable of surviving what theirs had just survived would need to become an entirely different marriage than the one that had existed before, built on habits neither of them had ever fully practiced, the habit of asking real questions, and the harder habit of actually waiting for real answers. Bianca called Marcus twice in the 2 weeks following the hospital scene. He did not answer either call, and the second time, he blocked her number entirely, an act so small and so late that it changed nothing about what had already happened, but that he needed, for his own sake, to do anyway. She sent one final message after that, a short, bitter text he never replied to, and Marcus deleted it without showing it to anyone, understanding, in a way he could not fully have articulated even to Dr. Rahman, that keeping it would have meant keeping some part of that year alive that he needed, finally, to let go of completely. Bianca, for her part, disappeared from the family's life within the year, the particular kind of disappearance that happens when the version of a man someone fell for turns out to have been standing on someone else's shoulders the entire time, and the ground beneath him, once you looked closely, was never really his own to begin with. She resigned from the logistics firm not long after, taking a position at a competitor across the state, and nobody in the family heard her name again, though Marcus would occasionally, in the years that followed, find himself thinking not of her specifically, but of the version of himself that had been so easily flattered by someone who understood so little about what he actually needed, a thought that embarrassed him more each time it surfaced. Grace, once fully recovered, began attending Sunday dinners again, and insisted, quietly but firmly, that they be held at Renata's house from then on, a small shift in tradition that nobody in the family questioned aloud, though everyone understood exactly what it meant. She took to arriving early to those dinners, the way Renata always had at every hospital and every family gathering for 11 years, and the two women fell into an easy rhythm in the kitchen together, Grace teaching Renata recipes from her own mother that Marcus had grown up eating and had never once thought to pass along himself. A small correction of the record that mattered more to both women than either ever said explicitly to Marcus. It was Grace, in fact, at the first of these dinners, who raised her glass before the meal and said, simply, to the table, that she was grateful this family had finally learned to see clearly, and that she hoped they would all remember, going forward, that the people who show up quietly, without asking for anything in return, are very often the ones a family cannot survive without. Nobody at that table needed her to say more than that. Everyone there understood exactly who she meant, and for the first time and longer than any of them could remember, nobody looked away from the truth of it. Whitman's business deal closed eventually, though not before Prentice Holloway learned, through channels entirely of his own and unconnected to anything Renata had said, exactly whose foundation had quietly kept his own elderly aunt alive during a surgery 2 years earlier at that same hospital. A piece of information that made him considerably more comfortable signing his name to anything connected to a family capable of producing a woman like that, even indirectly. Holloway mentioned it himself, in fact, at the closing meeting, telling Whitman almost offhandedly that he'd done a bit of digging into the family before finalizing terms. A habit he said he'd developed after being burned once before by a partner whose personal life turned out to hide far worse than a messy divorce, and that what he'd found in this case had, if anything, made him more eager to sign rather than less. The deal closed with better terms than Whitman had originally expected, terms that allowed both brothers to stay on in reduced but stable roles, and Whitman called Renata personally, awkwardly, to thank her, though she had done nothing at all to influence Holloway's decision beyond simply being who she had always been. Whitman, in that same call, apologized for the comment he'd made as she walked out of the waiting room, an apology Renata accepted plainly and without making him sit in the discomfort of it any longer than necessary, though she also did not pretend the comment had never happened. The two of them spoke more in the months that followed than they had in the previous decade combined, Whitman surprising himself by asking, on more than one occasion, genuine questions about how her company operated, questions that had nothing to do with the family at all and everything to do with a man beginning, slowly, to see his sister-in-law as a full person rather than a fixture at the edge of family gatherings. Whitman's own marriage, strained by the secret loan he'd taken out against his house, took longer to repair, and it was, in a small irony nobody in the family commented on directly, Renata who eventually recommended a financial counselor to Whitman's wife, the same quiet, practical kind of help she had spent years extending to strangers through her foundation, now finally extended openly to the family that had spent so long failing to notice she had anything worth offering them at all. Renata's company continued to grow in the following year, and for the first time, she stopped hiding it, not out of any desire for recognition, but simply because she had stopped feeling the need to make herself smaller in order to keep a fragile piece intact. She hired an office manager, expanded into a fourth county, and when a local business journal asked to profile her company's growth, she agreed, on the condition that the article focus entirely on the nurses and staff who made the work possible and not on her. Faith and Kim Durham, who had run the foundation's day-to-day operations quietly for years without ever being publicly acknowledged, was named executive director that same year at Renata's insistence, and the two women, who had spent years speaking only over hushed phone calls in hospital hallways, finally sat across from each other at a real table to plan the foundation's next decade. What stays with people who hear this story is not really the reveal in that waiting room, satisfying as it was. It is the 10 years that came before it, the decade of small humiliations absorbed without complaint, the quiet, unglamorous labor of building something worth having while the people closest to you insist you have nothing at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being underestimated by the very people who share your table every night, a loneliness that rarely gets named because on the surface everything looks fine. The dinners still happen, the holidays still get celebrated, the photographs still get taken, and only the person living inside that loneliness ever knows how much of herself she has learned to fold away just to keep the peace. It raises a question worth sitting with long after the story ends. How many people in your own life are quietly carrying far more than you have ever bothered to notice? And what would it cost you to find out before the day comes when you're forced to? Perhaps it is a mother who has spent decades minimizing her own needs so thoroughly that her children have stopped thinking to ask about them at all. Perhaps it is a spouse whose quiet competence has been mistaken, for years, for a lack of ambition, when in truth it was simply ambition pointed somewhere nobody bothered to look. Perhaps it is a sibling, a coworker, a friend, someone whose stillness has been read as emptiness by people who never once considered that stillness might be its own kind of strength, patiently accumulating. The same way a woman once filled a coffee tin one coin at a time until it became something nobody could take from her. Was justice really served in that waiting room? Or did Renata simply choose the version of peace that let her walk away with her dignity intact? There is an argument to be made that true justice would have looked different, that a woman carrying that much strength owed herself, if nothing else, the satisfaction of walking away entirely, of taking her company and her foundation and the wooden comb in her bag, and never looking back at a family that had spent over a decade failing to see her clearly. There is another argument, equally valid, that the deepest justice available to her was simply being seen, finally, fully, by the people who mattered most, and that everything she chose to do afterward, the counseling, the slow rebuilding, the decision to let Sunday dinners move to her own table, was not weakness or forgiveness handed out too easily, but its own quiet form of power. The power to decide on her own terms what her marriage would become, rather than letting a single humiliating afternoon decide it for her. Would you have signed those papers if you were in her place? Or would you have done exactly what she did and let the truth speak for itself? Would you have walked out of that hospital and never returned? Or would you have stayed to see whether the people who failed to see you were capable, given the chance, of finally learning how? There is no single right answer to that question, and this story does not pretend to offer one. What it offers instead is a woman who, for 10 quiet years, chose to build rather than to break, to fund rather than to flee, to hold a wooden comb in her hand and remember, in the hardest moment of her marriage, that patience had never once failed her, and to trust, one more time, that it would not fail her now. Perhaps the truest measure of Renata Cole was never the company she built or the foundation she funded, remarkable as both were, but the fact that even after everything, after the folder slid across that table, after her own husband handed her name to another woman in front of a room full of strangers, she still found it in herself to sit down at a kitchen table months later and try honestly, patiently, to find out whether something worth keeping still remained. Not every story like this one ends in reconciliation, and this story does not suggest that it should. What it suggests, simply, is that the choice belongs entirely to the person who was wronged, and that whatever she chooses, whether to rebuild or to walk away clean, deserves to be made from a place of clarity and strength rather than desperation. The same clarity and strength Renata had spent 30 years quietly building, one patient season at a time, long before anyone in that hospital ever learned her name. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next.